A while back somebody suggested doing a watercolor markers basics type video. So here it is, and this is about the markers that I use, because I don't use every single watercolor marker out there. And the first ones that I ever got were aqua markers by Letraset, and they're a twin tip marker. So you've got a very fine tip on one end, and when you uncut the other end you've got a bullet, a big fat bullet tip. And these are probably my sort of watercolor markers of choice, just because I've got a bit more experience with them. But I also have some of Winsor & Newton's watercolor markers that are also a twin-tipped watercolor marker, and they have a fine bullet tip on one end, but the big difference on the other end is it's much more like a brush tip, so you can use that to get in some really small fine areas, or just use it much more like a brush. So next up, the kind of paper that you need to use them on. And this is quite specific. When I first got some aqua markers, I had some Bockingford St. Cuthbert's Mill watercolor paper in with them. So they worked, brilliantly straight away. I was like, wow, these are fantastic. But then I tried them on other watercolor papers, and they didn't work so well. One other one that is good is the Winsor & Newton Artist watercolor paper. Again, both of these are 300 GSM because they are very thick watercolor papers. But both of these are good, and I use both of them. So you've got your markers and you've got your paper. It's time to use some brushes, or get some good brushes to use. And I use synthetic brushes. Here you can see a size 8 Galleria, which is actually an acrylic brush from Winsor & Newton. But I also use a size 4 synthetic brush by De La Rowney. And I just like synthetic brushes because they're a little bit stiff, a little bit springier than your classic watercolor brushes, and better for mixing the watercolor markers on the paper. And just a quick warning here, make sure you're using clean water when you're using watercolors or watercolor markers. You got to. So I talked earlier about papers, some papers being better for watercolor markers, some not so good. So I thought I would do a quick paper comparison here, and I start off with some Strathmore 190 GSM watercolor paper, and I just bung on a little bit of orange, I think this is tangerine orange aqua marker, and then add water in the way that I would normally use them, which is I put the marker onto the paper and then I apply the water. There are other techniques that I'll show later, but for now this is the kind of way that I always use them. So there's a little bit of aqua marker on the Strathmore paper. Next up I use a little bit of the Winsor & Newton watercolor marker on there, and again just put the marker on and then apply water and try and mix it around whilst it's on the paper. And hopefully you can see there is a little bit of streaking already on this paper. I'm going to go in a bit closer so you can see it, but you can see that where I put the markers down in the first place, they've stained the paper before I actually added water to them. So next I thought I would try a watercolor paper that I don't usually use with watercolor markers. This is the Langton watercolor paper. It's 300 GSM, so it's quite thick, and it's got a rough surface as well. So I start off using the aqua marker, again, watercolor marker, and then applying water and mixing it with the brush whilst it's on the paper. And I do exactly the same with the Winsor & Newton watercolor marker. Put it on, blend it together with water, and I was pleasantly surprised to see that I couldn't really see that much staining at all when compared to, say, the Strathmore. And I figure either it's a different kind of paper or it's just thicker, 300 GSM, but I thought this might be an actual paper that I can use in the future. So next up I do the same experiment on the Winsor & Newton watercolor artist's paper. So I whack on the aqua marker and then apply water to that, and I'm just blending it, moving it around. And you already notice that there is a difference on these thicker papers, on the 300 GSM paper. It's good quality paper. As soon as you put the aqua markers on, or the watercolor markers by Winsor & Newton, you can blend them around, you can move them around really easily with the brush. I got to add here that I am working straight away, so I'm putting the aqua markers on, the watercolor markers on, and then I'm adding water to them straight away. I'm not leaving them to dry. I know some people have had problems with any of these watercolor markers where they put them on to dry, hours later try and work on them, and they found that they've stained into the paper. I don't have that problem though, because I use the water on them straight away. And here you can see me using Bockingford St. Cuthbert's Mill 300 GSM, so a really nice thick watercolor paper yet again. And like I said, this is probably my favorite one to work on. I virtually get no problems at all using watercolor markers, either of the watercolor markers, on this particular paper, and it is just an absolute dream to use. Having said that, it is a bit more expensive, so I'm really glad to have found out during this video that the Langton watercolor paper actually works pretty good without having stains or any kind of problems. So here you go, I'm whacking all of the pieces out here with the colour tests on them, so you can see quite clearly when you compare the Strathmore to the others on the page there that it has stained, that the markers are such a strong pigment that they have stained the paper even when you try to work over them with the water afterwards. So it's time to have a look at some of the basic techniques, the basic things that you can do with watercolour markers. And the first one is what you've already seen me demonstrate, and this is the classic thing that I like to do because I'm a bit impatient. I like to just put the watercolour markers straight onto the paper wherever I think I need them, and then get a brush and mix them and blend them with the water whilst they're actually on the paper. I think it's just the way that I first used them when I first got them, and it's a way that I'm very, very familiar with, and I like using them this way. And in a way it stopped me being actually too fussy, weirdly enough, because I used to spend quite a lot of time mixing just the right colour in a palette, and I find that when I applied the markers directly to the paper and then add water, I don't do that so much anymore, and I kind of rely on some happy accidents and some kind of slightly unpredictable results that you get with your colours and your blending and your mixing when you put the markers straight onto the paper. So here you can see me working back into some markers using some clean water. So I put the clean water down separate to the marker, and then I just moved it and blended it up and down into the colour and across the colour to try and get a sort of fine gradation from light to dark. The other technique you can do is by mixing them in a palette. So you can see me get the palette out, put the marker into the palette, and then I actually add the water to the palette, mix it there, get the colour on the brush like you would with classic watercolours, and then apply it to the paper. And that works absolutely fine as well. I do find though that you find you're adding more water when you're actually blending in the palette, so the colours aren't perhaps as rich, as vibrant and as strong as when you apply the markers directly to the paper. And a third technique that you can use, a basic technique, is to apply water directly to your paper and then try and sort of paint in it using the marker. So you actually use the marker on top of water, and as you can see it can give you some really quite cool, very fluid and flowing, almost sort of tie-dye kind of results. But I'm a bit wary of doing this too often because there's a real lack of control in the way that it works, and also I'm worried that it might affect the nibs and make the nibs a bit squashy on the markers. But that's all single colour stuff. So what you do when you want to mix more than one colour together? Well, luckily it's pretty simple and straightforward. The way that I usually do it is I apply both colours to the paper and then mix them on the paper. So to make purple here I put a lot of red on, and because blue is a little bit darker I only put a little bit of the blue on, and then I blend the two together using water on the synthetic, the stiff brush. And as you sort of move them back and forth and blend them together on the paper, because it's 300 GSM paper you don't have to worry about rubbing through the paper, and it actually blends them together really well. Here I'm doing it slightly differently. I'm putting the two colours separately, putting on a bit too much blue though, so that when I blend these two together, yeah, they run together absolutely fine using the water, using the brush, but I put on a bit too much blue, so that's not going to be as purple as I wanted to. But it shows how you can mix two colours together. Of course the other way is to use the palette, so a lot of red, little bit of blue, mix them together in the palette with some water on the brush, and I get a nice purple colour that I can put on here. But again, like I said earlier, when you mix stuff in the palette you seem to use a bit more water, and as a result the colour is not as vibrant as when you put the pens, the watercolour markers, straight onto the paper and try and blend them there. So there you go, that's a basic introduction to watercolour markers and how you might use them in kind of a basic way. Let me know in the comments whether it was useful to you, whether there's anything else that you want to see demonstrated in a future video. And if you want to see them put to the test, then check some of the links below where you can see some of the paintings I've done with watercolour markers recently. Thanks for watching.